Welcome to Wisped Tales. Today, we share a story about learning to move on, even when closure feels impossible. Stay with us as we follow a journey of heartbreak, resilience, and finding peace within oneself. Avery Collins sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the phone that hadn't rung in weeks. The silence was deafening, filled with questions she didn't have answers to. The relationship she had poured her heart into ended abruptly, without explanation, without a single conversation to make sense of it. Friends told her she deserved better, that some things were not meant to be understood. But their words felt hollow. How could she move forward when her mind kept replaying every goodbye that never happened, every text that was left unanswered, every moment that now felt like unfinished business? For days, she tried distraction, scrolling through social media, binge-watching shows, keeping herself busy at work. But nothing seemed to quiet the relentless replay of memories. She remembered the late-night talks, the laughter, the shared dreams, and the subtle little moments that had meant so much. And yet the sudden void left behind was heavier than any heartbreak she had known. Her mind demanded closure, demanded understanding, demanded a reason why it all ended, but there was none. And in the absence of answers, Avery felt as though she was suspended in time, unable to move forward. One rainy afternoon, exhausted from her own thoughts, she decided to take a long walk along the river near her apartment. The water moved without hesitation, flowing past obstacles effortlessly. She noticed birds skimming the surface and leaves drifting in the current. And slowly, it hit her. The river didn't wait for answers, and neither would life. It kept moving, carving its own path regardless of the obstacles in its way. Avery felt the first spark of something she hadn't allowed herself in weeks. Perspective. Maybe closure wasn't about hearing the words she wanted, or understanding the other person's motives. Maybe closure had to come from within, from her own decision to stop lingering in the past.
That evening, she went home and sat at her small kitchen table, lit a candle, and opened a notebook she hadn't used in months. She wrote freely, without thinking about grammar, flow, or coherence. She wrote about the pain, the confusion, the anger, the longing, and most importantly, the lack of answers. And then she wrote one simple line: "I may not get closure from them, but I can give it to myself." Saying it aloud felt strange, almost defiant, but it also felt powerful. For the first time, Avery realized that the end of a relationship didn't have to trap her. She could choose to release the need for explanations and begin the slow, deliberate process of moving forward. She knew it wouldn't be easy. Some nights she would still cry. Some mornings she would wake up with the weight of unanswered questions pressing down. But she promised herself to take it one step at a time, one thought at a time, one breath at a time. Moving on without closure wasn't about forgetting, it was about reclaiming her own peace, her own story, and her own life. And as she closed the notebook and watched the rain patter against the window, she felt a tiny, fragile hope take root, the hope that she could be whole again, even without the answers she thought she needed. The next few days were challenging, as Avery discovered that moving on without closure was not a linear process. Some mornings she woke up feeling lighter, as though a small weight had been lifted. Other mornings, memories came rushing back, laughter shared over coffee, whispered secrets in the dark, moments she had thought were permanent. The hardest part wasn't missing him, it was missing the explanation, the reason why things ended so abruptly. She longed for a conversation, a word, anything that could make sense of the void. But instead of waiting, she began taking small steps to reclaim her sense of self. Avery started spending more time on things she had neglected. She joined a local pottery class she had once wanted to try, letting her hands shape clay as a way to channel her emotions. At first, her creations were clumsy, imperfect, but the act of creating became therapeutic. She painted in shades that reflected her moods, sculpted shapes that captured her frustrations, and let herself release the tension she had held onto for months. In these moments, she realized that closure wasn't something she had to receive, it was something she could craft for herself, in quiet acts of self-expression and care. She also reconnected with friends she had drifted from during the relationship. They didn't offer solutions or easy answers, they simply listened, laughed, and reminded her that life continued even in the absence of understanding. Dinner with her best friend, long walks with her sister, and casual conversations with coworkers became gentle reminders that she could feel connected without needing explanations from the past. Avery began to see that closure wasn't about getting someone else to behave differently. It was about giving herself permission to live fully, even in uncertainty. One evening, she sat by the window, sipping tea, watching the city lights reflect on the wet streets below. She thought about the relationship, the sudden ending, and the lack of closure.
The ache was still there, faint but persistent. Instead of fighting it, she allowed herself to feel it fully, letting the emotions flow without judgment. And then, softly, she whispered to herself, "I may never know why, but I can choose peace anyway." For the first time, she felt a shift, not a dramatic transformation, but a gentle easing, as if a door she hadn't realized was locked was now slightly open. Avery understood that moving on without closure wasn't about erasing the past or pretending it didn't matter. It was about honoring what she had felt, learning from it, and stepping into the future with courage. She began to see that life didn't have to pause for unanswered questions. It continued, full of possibilities she had yet to explore. And with each step, each small act of self-care, and each quiet moment of reflection, she felt herself reclaiming her strength, one heartbeat at a time. As the weeks passed, Avery noticed subtle but meaningful changes in herself. She no longer felt the urgent need to check her phone for messages or dwell on unanswered questions. The compulsion to understand why it ended, to seek explanations that would never come, slowly lost its grip. In its place grew a quiet sense of autonomy, a recognition that her happiness didn't have to hinge on someone else's choices or words. She began taking control of her own narrative, rewriting it in ways that centered her healing, her joy, and her peace. One Saturday morning, Avery decided to take a solo trip to a nearby coastal town. The wind whipped through her hair as she walked along the shoreline, the waves crashing rhythmically against the rocks. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of freedom she hadn't expected. Freedom from needing answers, freedom from holding on to the past, and freedom from the relentless questioning that had occupied her mind. Standing there, watching the ocean stretch endlessly into the horizon, she realized that life was bigger than any one relationship. bigger than the mysteries of closure. The world didn't pause for her heartbreak. It moved, vast and unyielding, and she could move with it if she chose. Back at her apartment, Avery began establishing routines that reinforced her independence. She cooked meals she genuinely enjoyed, danced around her living room to music that made her smile, and spent evenings journaling, not about him, but about her dreams, ambitions, and simple joys. She allowed herself to embrace solitude as a gift rather than a punishment. It wasn't always easy. There were moments of doubt and flashes of longing, but she learned to hold herself tenderly as she would a friend, and in those moments she felt a profound, stabilizing sense of self.
Avery also explored new friendships and hobbies with curiosity instead of expectation. She joined a local book club, volunteered at an animal shelter, and attended a painting workshop she had always been curious about. These activities didn't erase the past, but they filled her life with experiences that were wholly her own. She began understanding a powerful truth. Closure from someone else was optional. Closure from herself was essential. When she finally accepted this, she discovered a quiet liberation that no explanation, apology, or conversation could provide. By the end of the month, Avery realized that the void left by the abrupt ending had transformed into a space for growth. The unanswered questions no longer felt like chains, but like stepping stones, opportunities to cultivate resilience, self-compassion, and independence. She had moved from waiting for someone else to heal her to actively nurturing her own well-being. And with every sunrise, every act of self-kindness, and every moment she embraced life on her own terms, she felt herself becoming stronger, freer, and more complete. Avery began to notice that the more she invested in herself, the lighter her heart felt. She no longer spent hours replaying conversations in her mind or imagining how things might have been different. Instead, she focused on cultivating routines and habits that nurtured her well-being. Mornings became her sacred time. She practiced yoga by the window, journaled her thoughts, and sipped tea while watching the city wake up. These moments, simple as they were, became her anchors, helping her stay grounded when memories of the past threatened to pull her back into doubt or despair. She also learned to embrace the quiet moments that once felt unbearable. Evenings alone, once filled with anxiety, now became opportunities for reflection and creative expression. Avery started sketching, painting, and experimenting with writing short stories, not to impress anyone, but purely to enjoy the process. With each stroke of her pen and brush, she reclaimed a piece of herself that had been overshadowed by heartbreak and uncertainty. She discovered that moving on without closure wasn't about rushing or forcing herself to feel better. It was about honoring her feelings while gently choosing to let go. Over time, Avery noticed how her interactions with others changed. When friends or colleagues asked about her ex, she no longer felt a pang of tension or the urge to over-explain. She had learned that she didn't owe anyone an account of her healing process. She could acknowledge the past without being consumed by it. Conversations became lighter, laughter returned, and she found joy in moments that had nothing to do with him. Avery realized that closure wasn't an external event, it was internal. By letting herself accept the unknown and focus on what she could control, she began to find peace.
One chilly evening, she decided to revisit a park she used to walk through during happier times in the relationship. The familiar paths and trees brought a wave of nostalgia, but instead of sadness, she felt clarity. The memories were still there, but they no longer held power over her present. She could remember without hurting, smile without longing, and acknowledge the loss without letting it define her. The past, she realized, was a chapter, not her whole story. And just as the trees swayed in the wind without fear of change, she could move forward, resilient and self-sufficient. By the end of the week, Avery had reached a place she hadn't thought possible a month ago. She could reflect on the relationship, honor what she had learned, and still feel content in her own company. She began to understand that life didn't wait for closure. It moved on, relentlessly and beautifully, and so could she. And in those quiet, self-affirming moments, she whispered softly to herself, "I don't need answers to heal. I am enough. I am whole. I am moving forward." Avery began to notice the subtle strength she had built within herself. The heartbreak that once seemed all-consuming now felt like a distant echo, still present but no longer defining her every thought or decision. She had stopped chasing closure from someone else and had started creating it herself, piece by piece, through reflection, self-care, and daily acts of courage. Each morning she awoke with the determination to honor her own feelings, and each night she went to bed grateful for the small victories she had achieved. Moments when she had chosen herself instead of lingering in what was lost. Her days began to feel fuller, richer, and more meaningful. She took up running, feeling the rhythm of her breath and the steady pace of her feet as a form of meditation. She explored new cafes, tried cuisines she had never dared to order, and took herself on spontaneous adventures, allowing the freedom of solitude to guide her. With every step, Avery felt the weight of unanswered questions lessen. She understood now that closure was not about receiving explanations or apologies. It was about reclaiming her own power and embracing the life she was capable of building. Even her friendships deepened in this time. By not relying on others to fill her emotional gaps, Avery showed up more authentically in her relationships. She listened more, laughed more freely, and appreciated moments of connection without expectation. It was liberating to enjoy companionship without the fear of dependency. She discovered a balance between intimacy and independence, how to be close to others while remaining anchored in her own sense of self. The absence of closure, which had once seemed like an unbearable void, had become the space in which she cultivated resilience and self-trust. Some nights, the ache of the unknown still surfaced. She would feel the urge to reach out, to ask questions that would never be answered. But instead of giving in, she reminded herself of the progress she had made. She let the feeling pass, wrote down her thoughts, or went for a long walk in the quiet streets. Gradually, she began to embrace these moments as part of the healing process, recognizing that moving on without closure was not linear. It was a continuous act of self-compassion, patience, and courage. By the end of this chapter in her life, Avery felt a newfound sense of freedom. The past no longer held her captive, and the unanswered questions no longer haunted her every waking moment. She had discovered that healing could happen without explanation, that peace could be found without understanding, and that she was stronger than she had ever imagined. Standing on her balcony one evening, the city lights shimmering in the distance, Avery whispered softly to herself, "I may never have closure from them, but I have closure from myself.
I am free. I am enough. I am moving on.
In the weeks that followed, Avery's life began to feel like her own again. She realized that moving on without closure was not a sign of weakness or resignation. It was a testament to her strength and resilience. She no longer needed answers from the past to validate her present. She had cultivated a life that felt meaningful, even amidst uncertainty. Mornings were her sanctuary. Afternoons were filled with exploration and creativity, and evenings became a time for reflection and gratitude. Each day was an opportunity to practice letting go, to reaffirm her own worth, and to embrace the freedom that came with self-reliance. Avery also began to notice how her perspective on love had changed. She no longer saw relationships as the only source of her happiness. She understood that love could exist within herself first, and that by nurturing her own growth and self-respect, she could engage with others from a place of fullness rather than need. The absence of closure had taught her patience, self-compassion, and the importance of setting emotional boundaries. It wasn't easy. There were still nights when old memories or imagined conversations surfaced, but she faced them with calm acceptance rather than anxiety.
One afternoon, she visited a small cafe by the river, a place she had once gone to distract herself from heartbreak. This time, she sat quietly with a notebook, writing about her journey. She wrote about the moments of sadness, the moments of doubt, the small victories, and the joys she had discovered along the way. As she closed the notebook, Avery felt a deep sense of peace. She understood now that closure wasn't something that could be given by someone else. It was something she created for herself through patience, acceptance, and self-love. In the quiet of her apartment later that evening, Avery reflected on how far she had come. The weight of unanswered questions no longer held her down. The void left by the abrupt ending had transformed into a space for growth, freedom, and self-discovery. She had learned that moving on without closure was not about forgetting or erasing the past. It was about reclaiming her life, making peace with uncertainty, and finding strength in her own presence. Standing by the window, watching the sunset, Avery whispered softly, "I may not have all the answers, but I have myself. I am enough. I am whole. I am moving on." Thank you for watching Wisped Tales. If this story resonated with you or helped you see that healing is possible without closure, please like and subscribe. Next time, we'll bring you another inspiring story filled with hope, reflection, and lessons you can carry into your own life. Remember, sometimes the greatest closure comes from within. Trust yourself, honor your journey, and move forward with courage.